When Madeline left the room, she walked as far away from Calhoun as she could so she wouldn't end up running to him again. But then it was hard to do that when it wasn't her but him who came looking for her. Reaching forward, she glanced at her wrist where the vampire had bitten her. She blushed as she thought of the way his tongue ran over her skin. She had to get some water to wash her skin. What a shame and embarrassment! If someone in the village had heard, it would have turned into a complete scandal about a man sucking a girl's wrist, and she doubted whether it was less so with people who belonged to high status. She pulled out her handkerchief and began rubbing the area where his mouth had been, now turning red. "He's just a rude man who acts like a caveman," murmured Madeline in a low voice, getting angry of her own accord as she walked alone down the secluded corridor. God only knew what else she would experience while staying in the castle. It had only been a week since Calhoun had learned of her existence, and Madeline had approached the king as she danced with him, and here he was already claiming her wrist. What is this terrible behavior? Is this how the king behaves? She took the liberty of talking to herself as it was safe with no one around to listen to what she was saying, but more importantly, Calhoun wasn't here to listen to her complaints, so it was much easier to speak where her words wouldn't be twisted against her. In the right direction, Madeline continued walking, and as she was mumbling the words, she noticed two maids who were cleaning the window glass, talking in a low voice to themselves. "Is this correct?" asked one of the maids, her hand moving over the surface of the outside window. "Isn't that why Lady Sophie is here?" whispered the other maid. "But then we have the new human in the castle," Lady Rosamond told her one evening. "What do you think is going on?" The king said not to talk to her. She must be one of his mistresses. The maids were turning their backs to Madeline because they did not notice Madeline's presence, and they were whispering like squirrels. "But he didn't allow anyone to stay in his residence. Do you think he has done it yet?" "Yesterday, I saw her walking in only a king's coat." "How was she walking?" "I heard that the king is a quiet person in bed." As much as the maid lowered her voice, thinking that no one was listening, Madeline entered just in time to hear them talking. Madeline's jaws clenched together after she discovered that the maids were talking about her. "It went well," answered the other maid, who was asked whether the king had put Madeline in his bed. "It must be, because she is used to being taken along. Why else would the king bring an ordinary human to stay in the castle?" "Shh, someone will hear you," the maid next to her said before laughing. "There's no one here, so it should be okay. I heard that her parents sold her. This is not the first time this has happened. Only a prostitute gets such treatment." The maid who was wiping the glass stopped to say, "It is Lady Sophie who will be crowned queen, not a person who was chosen on a whim." Madeline gritted her teeth, narrowed her eyes even more, and took a step forward as her shoes clicked loudly on the floor. The two maids whipped their heads around to see who was here, and their eyes widened. Although earlier they were talking behind her back, they were now as pale as the lady had caught them. Madeline had never once been called insulting words, and hearing them now hurt her because what the maids talked about wasn't true. "Miss." The maids bowed their heads, showing respect that they clearly did not mean to give. The vampire would have received better treatment as well as reverence because of the position she held. But when it came to Madeline, it was clear from her appearance when she entered the castle with her parents for lunch that she came from a poor background. "Nice day, isn't it?" Madeline asked with a smile on her face that left the maids wondering if Mademoiselle had heard what they were talking about or if she had only arrived now because they had not heard her steps earlier. The maids could do nothing but adhere to the lady's opinion by nodding their heads, and the maid who called Madeline a whore said, "A very beautiful day indeed, lady. If you want this day to continue peacefully, I will ask you not to say nonsensical things that you are not aware of and have nothing to do with, unless you are not in love with yourself." The smile on Madeline's lips was gentle and polite, but her words made it clear what she meant. "Yes, ma'am," came the reply, and they bowed their heads to her. Madeline was not interested in staying with the maids who abused her and stayed away from there. She knew this would happen. After all, it was strange for the king to decide to keep his human close to him while paying attention to her when he could have any other woman who belonged to his level. People would talk. She would have to absorb it. The rest of the day passed as she tried to find out who had tried to poison the king. After taking a break, Madeline continued walking through the castle. When a maid appeared in front of her, "Miss," the maid bowed, "Lady Sophie asked you to come and join her for tea in her room in the evening." Madeline was not looking for company. "Tell Madame Sophie that I am not feeling well and will go to my room to rest." The maid bowed her head again. When the news got back to Lady Sophie, she narrowed her eyes at the maid. She said, "What?" Sophie asked. "Lady Madeline said she wanted to rest because she was tired," answered the maid under the vampire's glare. Sophie knew Madeline was okay. She had been wandering around the castle since the morning. She wanted to make a deal with the human. If the girl was not willing to come where she was, Sophie would go to her, and with that thought the vampire left her room and entered the king's residence. When she was about to enter, she was stopped by the guards who were standing there. "The king is not here, Lady Sophie," said one of the guards, who placed a stick to block her path. "I am here to speak to Madeline," Sophie said, looking at the two guards who dared to stop her. She didn't like being treated like this. She deserved to be treated with the utmost respect and not to stop. Once she becomes queen, this will never happen. The truth was, if Calhoun had not been there, the crown would have gone to her brother Marcus. She would have been closer to the crown as the king's sister, but the current situation wasn't bad either. If her brother Marcus turns out to be king, she will not have full rule in the castle or the land because she will be betrothed to another family. If she married Calhoun for political reasons, it would mean everything would be hers to keep and throw away. When the guards heard who she came to meet, they pulled their staffs back, and Sophie made her way to the king's beautiful and luxurious chamber to head to the human chamber. When Sophie arrived in front of Madeline's room, she found a maid standing by the closed door so that the maid could be helpful if the lady inside needed help with anything. Seeing Sophie's arrival, the maid bowed her head. Sophie was looking at the other side of the corridor trying to get a glimpse of the king's room when she said, "Tell Miss I'm here." With an air of superiority which she often carried with herself and which had been ingrained in her ever since she was a young woman. "Miss Madeline is not here," answered the maid, and Sophie's jaws pressed together. "I knew it." The human had blatantly avoided spending time with her. On the other side of the castle, Madeline had not been to the corridors since the morning as she was still trying to find out who the servant who tried to poison the king was. To think that she had eaten the meal on the same night that the poison was mixed in. She sighed. Evening fell and the sky slowly began to change. She could hear the birds chirping as they returned to their nests, and it made her smile. She wished she was a bird so she could fly away. "There are birds in the shed," a voice came not far from her, and Madeline, who had been looking up at the sky, turned to look at the man who was wearing clothes appropriate for a castle. Without knowing who the person was, she remained silent to hear him introduce himself. "I am Samuel Pemberton. I work for the king." He bowed his head. Madeline Harris bowed her head. "If you enjoy watching birds, the king has his own collection of them in the castle. I have some back in my palace as well." He was of average height and had blonde hair, with one ear pierced to hold a silver earring. "I'll keep that in mind," she replied. It was another vampire with red eyes. He looked at her curiously, and before he had any more time to stare at the girl, Theodore arrived in the corridor to steal the man's attention. "You're late with your report," he told Theodore in a voice that lacked energy and was as dull as the weather he was bored with. Samuel smiled. "I was talking to this lovely lady here about birds." The man's eyes turned back to look at Madeline. "She is the king's woman." Theodore broke the news as if it were no big deal, but a warning towards the man named Samuel, who raised his eyebrows. "From which type?" Samuel laughed, and Madeline felt her mood lighten even more than when she had caught the maids chatting about her. Although no words passed Madeline's lips, that did not prevent her from staring at the man because of the way he asked about her identity. The people who worked in and around the castle didn't seem to know how to behave politely, the kind where he doesn't want you to ask any questions about her, came the answer from Theodore, and Samuel's look finally left Madeline. "The king is waiting for you at court." Samuel nodded and began to head to where Theodore stood, but on the way, as he walked next to Madeline, the man's eyes dropped to look at the girl. Theodore warned him to stay away, but this only aroused the man's curiosity. After all, she was only human. But before the men left the corridor, Theodore told her, "Lady Madeline, the king wishes to see you." Madeline nodded. She didn't know what Calhoun wanted to do to her, but she followed them to the courtroom. While walking down the hallway, Madeline noticed how quickly the sky began to change color as it began to turn dark. When they arrived at the court, the man named Samuel got down on one knee and bowed his head to greet the kings. "Long live the King of Devon," he said. "My apologies for coming back late because I had a problem with the carriage wheel that took a while to fix. I brought the signed manuscript from Fleming's house." The man stood up and took out a scroll from his jacket. Calhoun was sitting on the throne with one leg crossed over the other. He took the manuscript.
3 days is a long time to fix a wagon, unless you take it apart and decide to rebuild it,
he said, his red eyes staring at Samuel. We were stuck in the middle of the jungle where there was no civilization, said Samuel, who had returned to his previous place.
What a pity that even a vampire could end up incapacitated.
Calhoun commented as he pulled out the parchment and saw the black seal on it.
It seems they complied sooner than last time, without any demands. Beheading their relatives turned out to be in our favor. Everyone needs the right motivation to be excited, right? Although I have to say, I've been waiting for you to come back for almost a week. The scroll must be delivered to the next kingdom.
The carriage, Samuel began, only to be interrupted by the king.
Yes, the broken cart. 3 days to fix it. I wonder what I did the other days. I hope you are a good man and are having fun out there. But then I'm sure you know how important your work is.
Calhoun said, his lips quirking in amusement. Madeline, who stood in the courtroom, looked back and forth between the king and the vampire named Samuel. Samuel replied, I went to work, my king. I will not cheat on my wife.
That's good to hear. I don't want to hear complaints from Lucy about how her dear husband is cheating on her with another woman, because I definitely wouldn't be happy if I broke her heart.
Calhoun said as one pulled his lips.
Well done on signing. See you tomorrow.
Madeline could feel the tension in the air. I wondered who Lucy was, as the king seemed to care about someone. I will not disappoint you, my king, Samuel said.
Let's both hope you don't.
Calhoun replied, then his dark red eyes slowly turned to Madeline, who was standing quietly.
What are you doing there, sweetie? Come here.
Madeline's cheeks turned red at his words. She walked towards him. Notice how Samuel's eyes fell on Madeline as he stared at her schemingly. When the two men's eyes met, Calhoun smiled an empty smile.
If that's all you can talk about, then you can take your leave.
Calhoun dismissed the man and Samuel bowed his head. As soon as the man left, Madeline heard Calhoun say to Theodore,
Keep track of what he's been doing over the past 2 weeks. I want all the details about where he is, who he met, and what he talked to.
Yes, sir, said Theodore. Calhoun sighed.
His character is questionable, which makes one doubt if he had anything to do with the recent poisoning.
And finally laughed. Only Calhoun could laugh at these kinds of things, Madeline thought to herself. With the man's departure, the king's attention focused on her.
How was your day? Did you find something interesting? Theodore said that you were in the cell. If you are interested, we can provide a room for you there.
Madeline's eyes glanced at the man who worked for the king before turning back to look at Calhoun. It seemed as if Theodore was nothing less than a tale, and everything that fell under his sight was reported to the king. I did not.
Tomorrow will be an interesting day. Do you know why?
When he didn't continue, Madeline asked, why?
Because someone will pay for their actions, but that's not all. I have asked Theodore to prepare the scaffold in your village. Are you excited?
Calhoun asked, his eyes shining with amusement and his lips raised in a wide smile.